I really enjoyed this morning's sessions. And as I was sitting there listening and taking notes, it struck me that we could not have had a more perfect setup for this afternoon's conversation. What I walked away with more than anything was this idea of competing voices all trying to capture our attention. You have to become profitable now, but you have to continue to invest in growth for the future. And you have to be an innovative company. And you have to concentrate on building a brand. And oh, by the way, there's this customer out there, including customers in far-off places like China, where we know a great deal of our success lies. Those are competing voices all trying to get your attention, and they're all valid. And in a sense, this is the essence of the organization governance challenge that you are in the middle of working through and will continue to do for some period of time. And there is not a company out there on your scale that isn't trying to do the exact same thing. I spent the better part of 3 years living with Nike, helping to guide their organization transition, and I can tell you there are plenty of confused and frustrated managers all over the world in that great company struggling through with many of the very same challenges that you are. So with that, let me share a little bit of what we've learned, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, of how global companies have been making this journey, particularly in this economy. Lots of new questions that weren't asked before by companies. Things like, are we focused on the real growth opportunities going forward, or are we still focused backward? How can we go to market with a more integrated brand and product offering to create the most compelling story for both consumers and B2B customers? How can we align ourselves to develop products faster in a true end-to-end fashion, across functions, across geographies? How can we leverage all this infrastructure that we've invested in? Because the pressure to do more with less is happening everywhere. It isn't going to go away. And lastly, do developed markets and the developing markets need to be organized in the same way? Does one size still fit all in our corporate organizational model? Many have concluded no. We're going to talk more about that in a workshop later in the week. These and a lot of other questions are being puzzled through by companies right now, trying to sort out this matter of how to govern in the sort of complexity that we live with today. And most are accepting that simplicity simply is no longer the target. The complex strategies require us to learn how to manage appropriately complex organizations. As much complexity as we need, and not more. And interestingly, there are sort of two forms of this complexity worth thinking about. And those of you who read the article in advance got a little bit of the background on this. We should be able to go through it fairly quickly. There is that thing called strategic complexity that has to do with the number of connection points that you have to wire up organizationally, either through structure or through process or through relationships or through practices and routines that will bring value. That's what Franz calls the rewarded complexity. And then there is that complexity that has more to do with what it feels like to work in one of these companies, where it feels like confusion. It feels like what somebody told me when I was interviewing a bunch of you folks in preparation for this and some other sessions. Fellows said to me, you know, the thing that makes me crazy is that there are lots of people on these teams who can say no, but nobody can say yes. That's what it feels like when you give in to the unrewarded complexity. The complexity that we create ourselves that doesn't necessarily add value. But we've got to learn how to manage that is rewarded. And of course, most importantly, we got to find a way to do it so as to not expose our customers to that. The irony of it is that a lot of the complexity that companies are creating today organizationally is there precisely to make it easier for customers. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. The key to managing the rewarded complexity and not drowning in the unrewarded complexity is how we align different pieces of organization. And the best way to tell that story is still the old STAR model from Jay Galbraith from many years ago. Many or most of you have seen this. Simple idea behind this model is that organization design is more than structure. Structure is one part of it. Organization design includes having smart end-to-end processes to glue the structural pieces back together, to have measures and reward systems, the incentives that we each pay a lot of attention to, aligned in a way that's consistent with the roles that we've been placed in and the objectives that we've been given, both for the greater company and for our own business. And we have to align the people practices, the right talent in the right seats, with the right performance management systems, talent management practices, and so forth. So these have to be aligned, and that is the key, simple to say, not so simple to do, to avoiding the experienced complexity, the unrewarded complexity. Unrewarded complexity happens when these are not aligned. And in the matrix, which is not new to Phillips, but there are some new features to it, this idea of alignment becomes all the more important. The matrix is here because we have to respond to all those competing voices that you listened to this morning. What the matrix does, and the reason it exists, is because we have to be able to do more than one thing very, very well at the same time. In a large conglomerate like yours, just at the group level, these kinds of things become very, very important. And these don't even speak to the competitive strategies that exist inside the 75 or more business units that you are working with. In most global companies today, and certainly multi-product companies, the matrix has at least 4 and often as many as 5 or even 6 axes of power and influence for managing people, businesses, assets. These 5 that are on the screen here are very typical. In every case, we'd see global business units. We'd see customer units for key accounts. We'd see functions. They might be growth functions or support staff functions. And we'd see the markets. Oh, yes, and then we'd see a subset of the markets called emerging markets or developing markets that have a seat at the table, just like Patrick Kung does here at Phillips. IBM did it first, about 6 years ago, and now countless companies have followed the same model, introducing more complexity into how we govern the business. The tension is very real. What you feel where you live is real, but it's there for a reason. It's there because each one of those power axes in the matrix has the capacity to extract value for shareholders. And if the goal was to make it simple and take all of the conflict out, all you got to do is leave money on the table. That's all you got to do. You remove some of those lines of reporting, and things get simpler, the conflict goes away, and the asset is underutilized. It boils down to that. So, in your company and most others, what we have is the need to learn how not to eliminate the conflict, but to manage it. The global business units are the players that have to create a global value proposition for a product line and build brands that have a consistent feel globally. But they need the market people pressing on them to make sure that those solutions are locally relevant to customers in the marketplace. At the same time, we assign functional responsibility to a line that has to make sure that we are paying attention to the standards of excellence in the functions, the staffing requirements, the cost requirements to be competitive in that function, and so forth. At the same time, we set up key accounts because we have customers that have a stronger voice than others and should and need to be represented at the executive table. And we have emerging markets where there are difficult places to do business, and we need to create infrastructure unique to those markets with a seat at the table. Competing voices, all valid, all have to be balanced. That's the organizational governance challenge that you're going to solve here in about an hour.